What begins as a routine discussion suddenly shifts, as a tense on-air exchange catches everyone off guard. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not because of shouting or spectacle, but because a carefully worded question lands a little heavier than anticipated, and the answer doesn't arrive as smoothly as everyone expects. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning, the atmosphere inside the studio felt familiar and relaxed in the way longtime viewers of a daytime panel show immediately recognize. The hosts were seated comfortably around the table, exchanging light remarks, the audience settling in with polite applause as the camera panned across the set. Hugh Jackman had joined the panel to discuss his latest project, and the tone at the start was exactly what viewers would anticipate from such an appearance. He was gracious, smiling, leaning forward as he spoke, clearly in conversation mode rather than promotional autopilot. The early questions focused on his work ethic, his return to the stage, and the balance he often speaks about between his professional life and personal values. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting at her usual position, listened closely as Jackman spoke. Her posture was relaxed, but attentive, her hands folded lightly as she followed his answers. As the discussion moved forward, the panel naturally transitioned from the project itself into broader themes, including public responsibility, personal accountability, and how entertainers navigate difficult conversations in a polarized cultural climate. This shift didn't feel abrupt to the audience. It was the kind of turn these shows often take, moving from the specific to the general, from promotion to perspective. Jackman spoke thoughtfully about choosing roles carefully and being mindful of the messages that stories send. He emphasized collaboration, respect, and learning from criticism, which drew nods from several of the co-hosts. The studio audience responded with light applause at moments that felt reflective rather than declarative. Everything still felt calm, controlled, and well within the rhythms of daytime television. It was at this point that Whoopi leaned slightly forward, adjusting her position at the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured and even, but the framing of her questions subtly changed the energy in the room. She referenced a broader debate that had been circulating in entertainment media, touching on how high-profile figures respond when audiences or colleagues challenge them publicly. Rather than citing a specific incident, she spoke in general terms, which made the question feel open-ended, but also pointed. She asked Jackman how he personally responds when he's criticized not for his work, but for the choices he makes about what projects to support or what conversations he engages in. She followed this by asking whether he ever feels pressure to take a clearer stance on controversial issues, especially when fans expect more than neutrality. It was a fair question by talk show standards, but it carried weight because it nudged the conversation away from safe ground and into more personal territory. There was a noticeable pause after the question. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a brief moment where Jackman seemed to choose his words carefully. He shifted slightly in his chair, his smile softening into a more neutral expression. The other hosts remained still, eyes on him, sensing that the conversation had entered a more delicate space. The audience quieted as well, the background noise fading in that way that signals collective attention. Jackman began by acknowledging the complexity of the issue. He spoke calmly about the difficulty of navigating expectations from different groups, emphasizing that no single response can satisfy everyone. His tone remained respectful, and he made it clear he understood why people ask those questions of public figures. As he spoke, he gestured gently with his hands, reinforcing the idea that he was explaining rather than defending. Whoopi listened without interruption, her expression serious but not confrontational. As Jackman continued, he explained that he believes in engaging thoughtfully rather than reactively, and that he tries to listen before speaking. This part of his answer seemed to align with the panel's general philosophy, and there were subtle nods from the other hosts. However, as he went on, Jackman added that he doesn't believe every moment calls for a public statement, and that sometimes silence or private action can be more meaningful than speaking out on a talk show or social media platform. This was where the tone shifted again, just slightly. Whoopi raised her eyebrows and tilted her head, a familiar gesture viewers recognize as her way of signaling a follow-up. She interjected gently, clarifying that the question wasn't about demanding constant commentary, but about recognizing when silence itself can be interpreted as a position. Her voice remained calm, but there was a firmness to it, a reminder that these conversations carry consequences whether someone chooses to engage or not. The interruption wasn't rude or abrupt. It was conversational, the kind that happens when a host wants to refine the focus of a discussion. Jackman paused again, acknowledging her point. He responded by saying he understands that perception matters, and that he reflects on that often. At the same time, he expressed concern about oversimplifying complex issues for the sake of sound bites. His body language remained open, but his tone grew more deliberate, indicating that he was aware of the tension in the exchange. The studio audience reacted with a mix of murmurs and light applause, reflecting the divided reactions that often accompany nuanced discussions. Some audience members seemed to respond to Whoopi's framing, while others appeared to appreciate Jackman's emphasis on thoughtful restraint. The camera briefly cut to the other hosts, who maintained attentive expressions, clearly letting the exchange unfold without steering it away too quickly. As the conversation continued, Jackman emphasized respect for differing viewpoints and reiterated his commitment to learning and growth. He spoke about engaging in conversations off camera, supporting causes privately, and being cautious not to reduce serious matters to performative gestures. His response was measured, but it also carried a quiet firmness, suggesting he felt strongly about maintaining authenticity over public pressure. Whoopi responded by acknowledging that authenticity matters, but she also stressed the influence of visibility. She pointed out that when someone has a large platform, even small statements can encourage broader dialogue. Her tone was not accusatory, but it was persistent, and the back and forth between them became the focal point of the segment. At this stage, the pacing of the show subtly adjusted. The host seated next to Whoopi glanced toward the clock briefly, aware of time constraints, but did not interrupt. The producers allowed the discussion to breathe, recognizing that this kind of exchange is often what viewers tune in for. The audience remained engaged, quiet but attentive, reacting occasionally with soft applause when a point resonated. Jackman responded once more, this time acknowledging that he doesn't have a perfect answer. He admitted that he sometimes struggles with knowing when to speak and when to listen, and that he accepts criticism as part of being in the public eye. This admission softened the moment, bringing the tension down slightly without resolving the underlying disagreement entirely. The energy at the table felt serious but respectful. No voices were raised, no sharp remarks exchanged. Instead, the tension came from the honesty of the discussion and the awareness that both perspectives held validity. It was the kind of moment that feels unscripted precisely because it doesn't resolve neatly. As part one of the segment came to a close, the conversation remained open-ended, with the audience aware that this exchange would likely continue after the break. The hosts transitioned carefully, maintaining the calm tone of the show while acknowledging the importance of what had just been discussed. Viewers at home were left with a clear sense that a thoughtful, slightly tense conversation had unfolded, one rooted not in conflict for its own sake, but in differing views on responsibility, visibility, and voice in the public sphere. As the show returned from the brief transition, the atmosphere at the table felt subtly different, not tense in an uncomfortable way, but more focused, as if everyone involved understood that the conversation had crossed into territory that mattered to people watching at home. Hugh Jackman was still seated comfortably, but his posture was more upright now, hands resting together rather than moving as freely as before. Whoopi Goldberg maintained her calm presence, her expression thoughtful, signaling that she wasn't looking for a confrontation, but clarity. The host who guided the discussion back and offered a short bridge, referencing the broader theme of public expectations and how entertainers navigate them. It was a gentle way of reopening the topic without framing it as a disagreement, and it gave Jackman space to continue explaining his perspective. The studio audience responded with polite applause, signaling appreciation for the seriousness of the conversation rather than any particular viewpoint. Jackman resumed by expanding on something he had mentioned earlier, explaining that his career has taught him the importance of listening before reacting. He talked about growing up in an environment where discussion was encouraged, but also where people understood the value of humility. His tone remained steady, and his words were deliberate, suggesting he wanted to be careful not to oversimplify his stance. He acknowledged that audiences today are more engaged and vocal than ever, which he said he respects, even when the feedback is critical. Whoopi nodded slightly as he spoke, signaling that she was following his point. When he finished, she responded not by challenging him directly, but by reframing the conversation once again. She pointed out that viewers often don't see the private actions he described, and that what they experience is what happens publicly. Her comment was delivered evenly, but it shifted the focus back to perception versus intent, a distinction that clearly mattered to her. The exchange drew a subtle reaction from the audience, a mix of murmurs and attentive silence. It was the kind of response that suggests people were weighing both sides rather than immediately siding with one. One of the co-hosts leaned in slightly, adding that these expectations aren't unique to actors, but apply to anyone with influence, especially in moments when social issues dominate public conversation. This broadened the discussion and reduced the sense that Jackman was being singled out. Jackman acknowledged this addition, agreeing that influence comes with responsibility. He clarified that his hesitation isn't about avoiding responsibility, but about wanting to ensure that when he does speak, it's informed and sincere. He mentioned that he worries about contributing to noise rather than understanding, and that sometimes stepping back allows him to learn more. His voice remained calm, but there was a noticeable firmness underneath, as though he was setting a boundary rather than deflecting criticism. Whoopi responded by saying she appreciated that honesty, but emphasized that silence can still feel loud to people who are directly affected by certain issues. Her body language remained open, hands resting on the table, but her gaze stayed fixed on Jackman, underscoring the importance of her point. She wasn't raising her voice or pressing aggressively, but the persistence of her questioning made it clear she felt this distinction deserved attention. At this moment, the pacing of the conversation slowed. There were slightly longer pauses between responses, and the hosts allowed those pauses to exist rather than filling them immediately. This gave the discussion a reflective quality, one that felt authentic to viewers who are used to more rapid-fire exchanges. The studio audience remained quiet, listening closely, which reinforced the seriousness of the moment. Jackman responded by sharing that he's learned over time that no approach is universally accepted. He explained that early in his career, he tried to respond to every expectation and found it exhausting and ultimately unproductive. He said that experience shaped his current approach, one focused on long-term engagement rather than immediate reaction. As he spoke, he glanced briefly at the other hosts, acknowledging that this is an ongoing conversation rather than a settled conclusion. One of the co-hosts interjected briefly, noting that many viewers might be hearing themselves reflected in this discussion, especially those who struggle with knowing when to speak up in their own lives. This comment brought a slight softening of the mood, and the audience responded with gentle applause. It reframed the exchange as relatable rather than exclusive to celebrities. Whoopi used this opening to emphasize that her question wasn't meant as criticism, but as an invitation to reflect on how visibility changes the stakes of everyday decisions. She spoke about how audiences project their own experiences onto public figures, sometimes unfairly, but often because they're searching for reassurance or solidarity. Her tone remained measured, but there was an emotional undercurrent that resonated with the room. Jackman listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. When he responded, he acknowledged that projection is real and that he doesn't take it lightly. He said he understands that people look to familiar faces during uncertain times, and that he tries to honor that trust without pretending to have answers he doesn't. This response drew a more audible reaction from the audience, a brief round of applause that suggested appreciation for his candor. The conversation then shifted slightly toward how these moments are edited and shared beyond the live broadcast. One host pointed out that short clips often circulate without full context, intensifying reactions and misunderstandings. Jackman agreed, noting that nuance is often lost in those moments, which makes him even more cautious about how he communicates. Whoopi acknowledged this challenge, adding that it's a reality everyone in media faces, not just guests. As this part of the discussion unfolded, the tension that had been present earlier transformed into something more reflective. The disagreement hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into a deeper exploration of the issue. The audience appeared engaged rather than divided, reacting with thoughtful silence instead of audible murmurs. Toward the end of the segment, the host gently guided the conversation back toward balance, thanking Jackman for engaging openly and Whoopi for raising an important perspective. The transition felt natural, not abrupt, signaling that while the discussion was meaningful, the show needed to move forward. Jackman smiled, offering a brief acknowledgement to the panel, and Whoopi returned the gesture with a nod. As the cameras prepared to shift focus again, the atmosphere at the table felt respectful and grounded. The exchange had not produced a clear resolution, but it had offered viewers insight into how these conversations unfold in real time, with all their complexity intact. It was clear that the dialogue would linger with audiences, inviting reflection rather than delivering a definitive takeaway, and setting the stage for the discussion to continue as the show progressed. As the conversation continued, there was a noticeable sense that everyone at the table was aware of how closely viewers were following along. The initial tension had settled into something more deliberate, where each comment felt carefully chosen. Hugh Jackman remained engaged, leaning slightly forward, signaling that he was still fully present in the discussion rather than waiting for it to move on. Whoopi Goldberg, in turn, maintained her steady, composed demeanor, listening as much as she spoke. One of the co-hosts gently reintroduced the topic by referencing how moments like these often spark broader conversations beyond the studio. She mentioned that viewers frequently write in or comment online, saying they appreciate when guests don't shy away from difficult questions. This framing shifted the focus away from the exchange itself and toward its impact, a familiar technique in daytime talk shows that helps contextualize challenging discussions. Jackman responded by saying that he welcomes tough questions, even when they're uncomfortable. He explained that part of the reason he accepts invitations to live shows like this is because they allow for real-time dialogue, something that can't be replicated in pre-recorded interviews. His tone was sincere, and his body language open, suggesting that he viewed the moment not as a challenge to overcome, but as a conversation to engage with. Whoopi picked up on that point, agreeing that live television has a way of revealing authenticity. She added that viewers can usually tell when someone is giving a rehearsed answer versus speaking from experience. As she said this, she gestured lightly toward Jackman, acknowledging that he had been candid. The audience responded with a brief, supportive round of applause, reinforcing the sense that honesty was being valued over agreement. The discussion then turned toward the role of generational perspectives in shaping expectations. One host noted that younger audiences often expect more immediate responses from public figures, while others value restraint and reflection. Jackman agreed that generational differences play a role, explaining that he's observed how rapidly conversations move now compared to earlier in his career. He spoke about learning to adapt without losing his own sense of balance. Whoopi interjected here, pointing out that while generational differences exist, certain core expectations remain the same, especially around empathy and accountability. Her tone remained calm, but the point was clearly important to her. She emphasized that viewers aren't always looking for answers, but for acknowledgement. This comment subtly reframed the earlier disagreement, focusing less on action and more on presence. Jackman paused briefly before responding, indicating that he was considering her words. He agreed that acknowledgement matters, and shared that he tries to express empathy even when he doesn't have a fully formed position. He admitted that he sometimes worries about saying the wrong thing, but that fear shouldn't outweigh the need to connect with people. This admission felt significant, and the audience reacted with a low murmur of approval. At this stage, the exchange had taken on a more collaborative tone. The hosts were building on each other's points rather than challenging them directly. One co-host remarked that these kinds of conversations are rarely neat or satisfying, but they're necessary. The comment drew a small round of applause, reflecting a shared understanding among the audience. Whoopi nodded in agreement, adding that discomfort is often part of growth, both for individuals and for audiences. She clarified that her original question was rooted in that belief, not in an expectation of perfection. Her body language softened slightly, shoulders relaxing as she spoke, signaling that the earlier tension had eased. Jackman responded by thanking her for clarifying that, saying he appreciated the opportunity to talk it through. He reiterated that he doesn't view criticism as something to avoid, but as something to learn from. His tone was reflective rather than defensive, and it was clear he was trying to communicate respect for differing viewpoints. The conversation then shifted briefly to how these discussions influence the work he chooses. Jackman explained that he's become more intentional about projects that encourage dialogue rather than division. He was careful not to frame this as a moral stance, but as a personal choice shaped by experience. The hosts listened attentively, allowing him to elaborate without interruption. Whoopi acknowledged this, noting that intention doesn't always translate perfectly, but it's still meaningful. She mentioned that audiences often judge outcomes more than intentions, which is where misunderstandings can arise. Her comment was delivered calmly, but it reinforced the central theme of perception versus intent that had run through the entire segment. The studio audience remained engaged, reacting subtly through posture and expressions rather than loud responses. It was clear that this was not a moment for applause-driven sound bites, but for sustained attention. The camera work reflected this as well, lingering on faces rather than cutting rapidly, giving viewers at home a sense of being present in the room. As the segment progressed, the host guiding the discussion gently acknowledged the complexity of the topic and thanked both Whoopi and Jackman for modeling a respectful exchange. This comment served as a cue that the conversation would soon move on, but it didn't feel like an attempt to shut it down. Instead, it felt like recognition of the value of what had been shared. Jackman offered a final thought in this part of the discussion, saying that he believes conversations like this are ongoing, not one-time events. He emphasized that he's still learning, still listening, and still adjusting. His voice was steady, and his words carried a sense of humility that resonated with the audience. Whoopi responded with a simple acknowledgement, saying that learning in public isn't easy, but it's important. Her tone was warm, signaling mutual respect. The moment closed with a sense of understanding, even if not complete agreement. As the cameras prepared to transition again, the energy in the studio felt calmer and more reflective than before. The disagreement that had sparked the exchange had evolved into a nuanced conversation, one that allowed space for differing perspectives without turning combative. Viewers watching live would have recognized this as one of those moments that stays with you, not because of dramatic confrontation, but because of the honesty and restraint on display. As the show moved forward, the conversation didn't abruptly shift away from what had just been discussed. Instead, it carried a quieter momentum, as though the earlier exchange had set a thoughtful tone for everything that followed. Hugh Jackman remained attentive, occasionally nodding as other hosts spoke, while Whoopi Goldberg maintained her steady presence, signaling that while her point had been made, she was still engaged in listening. One of the co-hosts eased the discussion into a related area by asking Jackman how he personally processes feedback after a public appearance like this one. It was a natural progression, bridging the live conversation with the behind-the-scenes reality of being a guest on a show watched by millions. The audience responded with soft laughter and light applause, recognizing the familiarity of that experience for public figures. Jackman answered candidly, explaining that he often replays conversations in his mind afterward, reflecting on what he could have said differently or more clearly. He spoke about the importance of self-reflection without self-criticism, emphasizing that growth comes from being open to discomfort. His tone was calm and introspective, and his posture remained open, signaling that he wasn't closing himself off from the discussion. Whoopi responded by sharing that she's had similar experiences throughout her career, especially in moments when conversations didn't land the way she intended. She noted that live television doesn't allow for revisions, which is why intention and listening matter so much in real time. Her comment wasn't framed as advice, but as shared experience, and it drew a warm reaction from the audience. The exchange prompted another host to comment on how viewers often underestimate the vulnerability involved in speaking openly on live television. She pointed out that there's no pause button, no chance to rewrite, which makes these moments both challenging and valuable. Jackman agreed, adding that the immediacy of live discussion is what makes it meaningful, even when it's uncomfortable. As the conversation continued, Whoopi gently revisited her earlier point, not to press it further, but to clarify why she felt it was important. She explained that many viewers see themselves reflected in these conversations and look for cues on how to navigate their own difficult discussions. Her tone was thoughtful, and her body language remained relaxed, reinforcing that her intention was to broaden understanding rather than assign blame. Jackman acknowledged this perspective, saying he hadn't fully considered how closely people might identify with these moments. He admitted that hearing that gave him a deeper appreciation for the responsibility that comes with visibility. His response felt genuine, and the audience reacted with a brief, supportive applause, signaling recognition of that acknowledgement. The hosts allowed the moment to settle before moving on, giving viewers time to absorb what had been said. The pacing remained unhurried, which is often a deliberate choice in daytime television when discussions take a serious turn. The camera lingered on the panel rather than cutting away, reinforcing the sense that this was a conversation worth sitting with. Another co-host briefly shifted the focus to how public expectations have changed over time, noting that audiences now expect more transparency than in previous decades. Jackman agreed, saying that the evolution has been rapid and sometimes challenging, but ultimately positive. He emphasized that accountability and openness are important, even if they're uncomfortable. Whoopi added that transparency doesn't mean having all the answers, but being willing to engage. Her comment echoed earlier themes and helped tie the conversation together. The audience responded with quiet agreement, a few nods visible in the background as the camera captured wider shots of the studio. As the segment neared its end, the host guiding the show gently summarized the discussion, highlighting the value of respectful dialogue and differing perspectives. This summary served as a soft landing, signaling that while the conversation had depth, it was time to transition to the next part of the program. Jackman smiled and thanked the panel for the thoughtful exchange, and Whoopi returned the sentiment with a nod and a brief smile. The studio atmosphere at this point felt calm and respectful, without any lingering sense of conflict. The earlier tension had been absorbed into a broader understanding, leaving viewers with insight rather than unresolved discomfort. The audience applauded as the show prepared to move on, not loudly or dramatically, but with the kind of appreciation that follows a meaningful conversation. As the cameras shifted and the segment wrapped up, it was clear that this exchange would likely resonate beyond the live broadcast. It had touched on themes familiar to many viewers, framed through a real-time, unscripted discussion that felt authentic to the format of a daytime talk show. The groundwork had been laid for continued conversation, both on and off the screen, setting the stage for how the moment would be discussed once the episode aired. As the segment moved toward its conclusion, there was a clear effort from the hosts to bring the conversation to a thoughtful close rather than an abrupt ending. The lead host thanked Hugh Jackman for his openness and willingness to engage in a discussion that went beyond the usual promotional talking points. The tone of her voice suggested appreciation rather than relief, reinforcing that the exchange had been valued rather than endured. Jackman responded with a polite smile, offering a brief thank you of his own, and acknowledging the panel for allowing space for a meaningful conversation. Whoopi Goldberg offered the final on-air remark before the transition, reiterating that conversations like this are important precisely because they don't always produce simple answers. Her delivery was calm and reflective, not pointed, and it carried the weight of someone accustomed to navigating complex discussions on live television. Jackman nodded in agreement, signaling shared understanding even where perspectives differed. The studio audience responded with sustained applause, louder than earlier in the segment, but still measured, reflecting appreciation rather than excitement. There were no audible gasps or dramatic reactions, just a collective acknowledgement that something substantial had taken place. The camera briefly captured audience members nodding and clapping, reinforcing the sense that the discussion had resonated in the room. As the show transitioned to the next segment, the hosts exchanged quick glances and relaxed expressions, the kind that often follow a serious conversation handled well. Jackman remained seated for a moment longer, sharing a quiet word with the host beside him as the microphones began to lower. The atmosphere felt settled, as though everyone involved was comfortable with how the discussion had unfolded. Once the episode aired, it didn't take long for viewers to begin reacting. On social media, clips of the exchange circulated, particularly the moment where Whoopi clarified her question and Jackman acknowledged the complexity of public expectation. Many viewers praised the conversation for its restraint, noting that it was refreshing to see disagreement handled without raised voices or defensiveness. Others focused on specific points, debating whether public figures should feel obligated to speak more directly on social issues. Comment sections reflected a wide range of responses. Some viewers felt Whoopi's question was necessary and long overdue, arguing that visibility comes with responsibility. Others appreciated Jackman's emphasis on thoughtful engagement, saying his approach mirrored how many people struggle with knowing when to speak up in their own lives. What stood out was that the discussion continued, not as outrage, but as dialogue. In the hours following the broadcast, entertainment commentators referenced the exchange as an example of how daytime talk shows can still facilitate meaningful conversation. A few panel discussions and opinion pieces highlighted the segment as proof that tension doesn't have to escalate into conflict to be compelling. The show itself shared a short clip online, framing it as a conversation about responsibility, listening, and public voice. Jackman later addressed the appearance in a brief interview, saying he appreciated the chance to talk through a difficult subject in a respectful environment. He emphasized that he didn't view the exchange as a confrontation, but as part of an ongoing learning process. His comments echoed the tone of the segment, reinforcing that there were no hard feelings and no attempt to retreat from what had been said. Whoopi also briefly referenced the moment on a later episode, clarifying that her intent was to encourage reflection rather than criticism. She reminded viewers that disagreement can be productive when handled with respect, and that live television offers a rare opportunity to explore those moments in real time. Her comments help contextualize the exchange for viewers who may have only seen short clips online. In the days that followed, the segment continued to be mentioned in discussions about media responsibility and public discourse. While opinions remained divided, the overall response was measured, with many viewers acknowledging the value of seeing nuanced perspectives shared openly. The moment became less about who was right and more about how the conversation was handled. By the time the attention faded, the exchange had settled into the broader memory of the show as one of those moments that stood out quietly rather than loudly. It didn't rely on shock or spectacle, but on the honesty of a live discussion that unfolded naturally, with all its pauses, clarifications, and unresolved questions intact. And now that you've seen how that conversation played out, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.